Part 2. Money and Interest. Chapter 1. Barter. Abstract. Because the opportunity cost of a good cannot be fixed, it is impossible to know the proper exchange ratios for barter. This problem is overcome in the market by using commodities that have marketable characteristics such as transportability, durability, and a recognized economic value to serve as a medium of exchange. Prices of goods do not strictly follow the quantity theory of money. In Part 1, an attempt was made to prove that the real value of everything used by men is proportional to the quantity of land used for its production and for the upkeep of those who produced it. In this Part 2, I will start by summing up the different degrees of land fertility in several countries and the different kinds of products it can bring forth in greater abundance according to its intrinsic quality. Then, assuming the establishment of towns and their markets to facilitate the sale of these products, it will be shown by comparing exchanges that could be made, wine for cloth, wheat for shoes, hats, etc., and by the difficulty involved in transporting these different products or merchandises, that it was impossible to fix their respective intrinsic value. Therefore, it was absolutely necessary for men to find a substance easily transportable, not perishable, and having by weight a proportion or value equal to the different products and merchandises, whether needed or convenient. Hence, there arose the choice of gold and silver for large business and of copper for small transactions. These metals are not only durable and easy to transport, but correspond to the employment of a large area of land for their production, which gives them the true value people seek in an equivalent, i.e., a medium of exchange. Mr. Locke, who, like all the English writers on this subject, has looked only to market prices, establishes that the value of all things is proportional to their abundance or scarcity, and to the abundance or scarcity of the silver for which they are exchanged, i.e. the naive quantity theory of money. It is generally known that the prices of products and merchandise have increased in Europe ever since a great quantity of silver has been imported from the West Indies. However, I think we must not believe, as a general rule, that the market prices of things ought to be proportional to their quantity and to the amounts of silver in circulation in a particular place, because the products and merchandise that are to be exported do not influence the prices of those which remain. If, for example, there is twice as much wheat in a market town than what is consumed there, and we compare the whole quantity of wheat to that of silver, the wheat would be more abundant in proportion to the silver destined for its purchase. The market price will be maintained just as if there were only half the quantity of wheat, since the other half can be, and even must be, sent into the city, and the cost of transport will be included in the city price, which is always higher than that of the town. Nevertheless, apart from the case of hoping to sell in another market, I consider that Mr. Locke's idea is correct in the sense of the following chapter, and not otherwise. Chapter 2. Market Prices. Abstract. Market prices are determined by the bargaining between suppliers and demanders. Price determination by supply and demand is illustrated with a thought experiment that uses a fixed quantity of a perishable product, i.e. green peas, and known maximum valuations of consumers. Let us assume that there are butchers on one side and buyers on the other. The price of meat will be determined after some bargaining, and a pound of beef will be valued in silver, i.e. money, approximately the same as all beef offered for sale in the market, i.e. supply, is to all the silver brought there to buy beef, i.e. demand. This proportion, or price, is settled by bargaining. The butcher sets his price according to the number of buyers he sees, while the buyers on their side offer less if they think the butcher will make fewer sales. The price set by some is usually followed by others. Some are cleverer in marketing their merchandise, others in discrediting them. This method of fixing market prices has no exact or geometrical foundation, since it often depends upon the eagerness or the abilities of a small number of buyers or sellers. However, it does not appear that it could be done in a more suitable way. It is clear that the quantity of products or merchandise offered for sale, proportion to the demand or number of buyers, is the basis on which is fixed, or always assumed to be fixed, actual market prices. In general, these prices do not vary much from intrinsic value. Let us take another case. Several hotel managers have been told at the beginning of the season to buy green peas. One owner has ordered the purchase of 10 quarts for 60 livres, and another 10 quarts for 50 livres. A third, 10 quarts for 40 livres, and a fourth, 10 quarts for 30 livres. If these orders are to be carried out, there must be 40 quarts of green peas in the market. Suppose there are only 20. The sellers, seeing many buyers, will keep up their prices, and the buyers will come up to the prices asked, so that those who offer 60 livres for 10 quarts will be the first served. The sellers, seeing later that no one will go above 50, will let the other 10 quarts go at that price. Those who had orders not to exceed 40 and 30 livres will go away empty-handed. If instead of 40 quarts there were 400, not only would the hotel managers get the green peas much below the sums laid down for them, but the sellers, in order to be preferred over the others by the few buyers, will lower their green peas almost to their intrinsic value. And in that case, many managers who had no orders will buy some. It often happens that sellers who are too stubborn in keeping up their price in the market miss the opportunity of selling their products or merchandise to their advantage and are thereby losers. It also happens that by sticking to their prices, they may be able to sell more profitably another day. Distant markets can always affect the prices of local markets. If wheat is extremely expensive in France, its price will increase in England and in other neighboring countries. Chapter 3. The Circulation of Money. Abstract. Farm production produces 3 rents, one of which sustains the farm workers, while the other 2 can be sold at wholesale to entrepreneurs, who in turn provide property owners and farmers with goods and merchandise. This is the circular flow model of the economy. Money facilitates the flow and timing of rent payments, i.e. velocity, and the rate of the monetary flow determines the ratio between the quantity of money and the value of annual production. This model is then used to explain the implications of international trade. It is the general opinion in England that a farmer must make 3 rents. The first is the principal and true rent that he pays to the property owner, which is assumed to be equal in value to 1/3 of the farm's output. A second rent goes for his maintenance and that of the men and horses he employs to operate the farm, and a third rent that he keeps from making the business profitable. The same idea generally is the norm in other countries of Europe, though in some states like Milan, the farmer gives up half the product instead of a third. It is also true that many landlords in all countries try to lease their farms at the highest price they can. But when it is above 1/3 of the product, the farmers generally are very poor. I do not doubt that the Chinese landowner extracts from his farmer more than 3/4 of the product of the land. However, when a farmer has some capital to carry on the management of his farm, the owner who leases him the farm for 1/3 of the product will be sure of payment and will be better off by such a deal than if he leases his land at a higher rate to a poor farmer and faces the risk of losing all his rental income. The larger the farm, the better off the farmer will be. This is seen in England, where farmers are generally more prosperous than in other countries where farms are small. The assumption I shall make in this inquiry of the circulation of money is that farmers earn 3 rents and they spend the third rent to live more comfortably instead of saving it. This is indeed the case with most farmers in all countries. All the products in the state come directly or indirectly from the hands of the farmers, as well as all the materials from which commodities are made. The land produces everything but fish, and even then, the fishermen who catch the fish must be maintained by the products of the land. The 3 rents of the farmer must therefore be considered the principal sources, or, so to speak, the mainspring of circulation in the state. The first rent must be paid to the property owner in cash. For the second and third rents, cash is needed for the iron, tin, copper, salt, sugar, cloth, and generally all the products from the city that are consumed in the countryside. However, all that hardly exceeds 1/6 of the total of the 3 rents. As for the food and drink of the country folks, cash is not always necessary to obtain them. The farmer may brew his beer or make his wine without spending money. He can make his bread, slaughter the oxen, sheep, pigs, etc. that are eaten in the country. He can pay most of his assistants in wheat, meat, and drink, not only laborers, but country artisans as well, by valuing products at the prices of the nearest markets and labor at local wage rates. The things necessary to life are food, clothing, and housing. There is no need for cash to obtain food in the country, as I have just explained. If coarse linen and cloths are made there, and if houses are built there, as is often the case, the labor may be paid in barter by valuation without cash being needed. The only cash needed in the countryside is for the rent payment to the property owner and for the goods obtained from the city, such as knives, scissors, pins, needles, cloths for some farmers or other well-to-do people, kitchen utensils, plates, and generally all that is obtained from the city for use in the countryside. I have already noted that it has been estimated that half the inhabitants of a state live in the cities, and that consequently those who live in the city consume more than half the production of the land. Cash is therefore necessary, not only for the rent payment to the owner, corresponding to 1/3 of the product of the land, but also for the city merchandise consumed in the country, which may amount to something more than 1/6 of the product of the soil. However, 1/3 and 1/6 amount to half the product. The cash circulating in the country must therefore be equal to at least 1/2 the product of the land, while the other half, or somewhat less, may be consumed in the country without need for cash. The circulation of this money takes place when the property owners spend the rents they collect in lump sums from the farmers on retail purchases in the city. The entrepreneurs of the city, example butchers, bakers, brewers, etc., then collect the same money, little by little, in order to buy goods from the farmers, such as cattle, wheat, barley, etc. In this way, all the large sums of money are distributed in small amounts, and all the small amounts are then collected to make payments in large amounts, directly or indirectly, to the farmers. Therefore, this money serves both in wholesale and retail. When I stated that the necessary quantity of money for circulation in the countryside is often equal to half the product of the land, this is the minimum. For the circulation in the countryside to be easily conducted, I will suppose that the cash needed is equal in value to 2/3 of the farmer's income, or 2/3 of the product of the land. It will be seen later that this assumption is not far from the truth. Let us now imagine that the money conducting the whole circulation in a small state is equal to 10,000 ounces of silver, and that all the payments made with this money, country to city and city to country, are made once a year. In addition, these 10,000 ounces of silver are equal in value to 2 of the farmer's rents, or 2/3 of the product of the land. The rent collected by the property owners will correspond to 5,000 ounces, and the whole circulation of the remaining silver between the people of the countryside and those of the city, made by annual payments, also will correspond to 5,000 ounces. However, if the owners stipulate that their farmers make payments every 6 months instead of once a year, and if the other debtors also make their payments every 6 months, this will alter the pace of circulation. While 10,000 ounces were needed to make the annual payment, only 5,000 will now be required, because 5,000 ounces paid twice over will have the same effect as 10,000 ounces paid once. Furthermore, if the owners stipulate that their farmers make quarterly payments, or if they are satisfied to receive payments from the farmers as the 4 seasons enable them to sell their products, and if all other payments are made quarterly, only 2,500 ounces will be needed for the same circulation that would have required 10,000 ounces paid annually. Therefore, supposing that all payments are made quarterly in the small state in question, the proportion of the value of the money needed for the circulation is to the annual product of the soil, or the 3 rents, as 2,500 livres is to 15,000 livres, or 1:6. So that money would correspond to a 1/6 of the annual production. However, considering that each branch of the circulation, i.e. the economy, in the cities is carried out by entrepreneurs, and that the consumption of food is paid for daily, weekly, or monthly, and that clothing purchased once or twice a year by families is paid for at different times by different people, and considering also that the expenditure on beverages is usually made daily, and that the payment for beer, coal, and 1,000 other articles of consumption is very prompt, then it would seem that the proportion we have established for quarterly payments would be too high, and that the circulation of products estimated at 15,000 ounces of silver in value could be conducted with much less than 2,500 ounces of silver coins. However, because farmers have to make large payments to the owners at least every quarter, and that the taxes collected by the prince or the state upon consumption goods are accumulated by the tax collectors to make large payments to the receivers general, there must be enough cash in circulation to make these large payments without difficulty, and without hindering the circulation of currencies for the food and clothing of the people. It will be understood from this that the proportion of the amount of money needed for circulation in a state is not incomprehensible, and that this amount may be greater or less in a state depending on the mode of living and the speed of payment. It is very difficult to lay down anything definite about this quantity in general, as the proportion may vary in different countries. Therefore, it is only conjectural when I say that generally, the cash or money necessary to carry on the circulation and exchange in a state is roughly equal in value to 1/3 of all the owner's annual rents of the said state. Whether money is scarce or plentiful in a state, this proportion will not change much, because where money is abundant, land is leased at higher rates and at lower rates where money is scarce. This rule will always be true at all times. In states where money is scarcer, there usually is more barter by valuation than in those where money is plentiful, and circulation is more prompt and less sluggish than in those where money is not so scarce. Thus, it is always necessary when estimating the amount of money in circulation to take into account the speed of its circulation. Assuming that the money in circulation is equal to 1/3 of all the owner's rents and that these rents equal to 1/3 of the annual product of the land, it follows that the money circulating in a state is equal in value to the 1/9 of all the annual production of the land. Sir William Petty, in a 1685 manuscript, frequently assumes that the money in circulation is equal to 1/10 of the product of the land without explaining his reasoning. I believe he formed this opinion from experience and from his practical knowledge of both the money circulating in Ireland, a country he had measured as a surveyor, and of production, which he estimated from observation. I am not far removed from his idea. However, I choose to compare the money circulating to the owner's rents, which are ordinarily paid in cash and easily ascertainable by a uniform land tax, rather than to the products of the land because of their daily price variations in the markets, and the fact that a large part of the product is consumed without ever entering the markets. In the next chapter, I shall give several reasons supported by examples to strengthen my conclusion. I think this rule is useful even if it is not mathematically exact in any country. It is sufficient if it is near the truth and if it prevents governors of states from forming extravagant ideas about the amount of money in circulation. There is no branch of knowledge in which one is more subject to error than statistics when they are based on one's imagination, and none is more informative when they are based upon detailed facts. Some cities and states which have no land to call their own subsist by exchanging their labor and manufactured goods for the products of other lands. For example, in Hamburg, Danzig, several other cities of the empire, and even part of Holland, it seems more difficult to estimate the amount of cash in circulation. However, if we could estimate the amount of foreign land used for their subsistence, the calculation would probably not differ from the one I made for the other states that chiefly subsist on their own products and which are the subject of this essay. As to the cash needed to carry on foreign trade, it seems that no more is required than what is in circulation in the state when the balance of foreign trade is equal. That is, when the products and merchandise sent abroad are equal in value to those imported. If France sends cloth to Holland and receives spices of equal value in return, the property owner who consumes these spices pays their value to the grocer, who pays the same amount to the cloth maker, to whom the same amount is due in Holland for the cloth he sent there. This is done using bills of exchange, which I will explain later. These two payments take place in France, unconnected to the rent of the property owner, and no money leaves France because of these transactions. All other classes of society consuming Dutch spices similarly pay the grocer. Those living on the first rent, that is the property owners, pay from this rent, and those who live on the other two rents in the country or the city pay the grocer, directly or indirectly, out of the money that conducts the circulation of these rents. The grocer again pays this money to the manufacturer in Holland for his bill of exchange, and when the balance is equal, no increase of money is needed for circulation in the state due to foreign trade. But if it is not equal, if more merchandise is sold to Holland than is bought back, or vice versa, money is needed for the surplus that Holland must send to France, or France to Holland. This will increase or diminish the amount of money circulating in France. It may even occur that when the balance with the foreigner is equal to the trade with him, commerce with this foreigner may slow down the circulation of currencies, and consequently a greater quantity of money is required because of this commerce. For example, if the French ladies who wear French fabrics wish to wear Dutch velvets paid for by the cloth sent to Holland, they will buy these velvets from the merchants who imported them from Holland, and these merchants will pay the cloth manufacturers. The money thus passes through more hands than if these ladies took their money to the cloth manufacturers and contented themselves with French fabrics. When the same money passes through the hands of several entrepreneurs, the rapidity of circulation is slowed down. But it is difficult to make an exact estimate of this sort of delay, which depends upon various circumstances. Thus, in the present example, if the ladies pay the merchant for the velvet today, and the merchant pays his bill with the manufacturer in Holland tomorrow, and if the manufacturer pays the wool merchant the next day, and this last pays the farmer the day after, it is possible that the farmer will keep the money in hand more than 2 months to make up the quarter's rent he owes to his landlord. This money might, in 2 months, have circulated through the hands of 100 entrepreneurs without slowing down the circulation needed in the state. After all, we must consider the rent collected by the property owner as the most necessary and considerable part of the money in circulation. If the owner lives in the city and the farmer sells all his production and buys all the goods needed in the country in the same city, the money may always remain in the city. The farmer will sell products there exceeding half the output of his farm and will pay his landlord the money value of 1/3 of his product and the rest to merchants or entrepreneurs for goods to be consumed in the country. Even here, however, as the farmer sells his products for lump sums, which are subsequently distributed in retail purchases and are again collected to serve for lump payments to the farmers, the circulation always has the same effect, subject to its rapidity, as if the farmer took the money received for his products to the country and sent it back again to the city. The circulation always consists of the large sums received by the farmer for his products being distributed at retail and being brought together again to make large payments. Whether part of this money leaves the city or remains there entirely may be regarded as the circulation between city and country. All the circulation takes place between the inhabitants of the state, and they are all fed and maintained in any event from the product of the land and raw materials of the country. It is true that the wool, for example, which is brought from the country, is worth 4 times its former value when made up into cloth in the city. However, this increase of value, which is the price of the workman's labor and manufactures in the city, is again exchanged for the country's products that served for the laborer's maintenance. Chapter 4. Further reflection on the rapidity or slowness of the circulation of money in exchange. Abstract. Large transactions can be accomplished with the use of bills of exchange or barter, which reduces the demand for money. Ordinary transactions by people require actual coin money in circulation. A variety of factors, therefore, affect the flow of money in circulation, and this in turn affects the amount of money in circulation. Let us assume that the farmer pays 1,300 ounces of silver every quarter to the property owner, who pays every week 100 ounces to the baker, butcher, etc., and that these in turn pay the farmer 100 ounces every week, so that the farmer collects every week as much money as the property owner spends. In this case, there will be only 100 ounces in constant circulation. The other 1,200 ounces will remain held partly by the property owner and partly by the farmer. However, it rarely happens that the property owners spend their rents in a fixed and regular proportion. In London, as soon as a property owner receives his rent, he deposits most of it with a goldsmith or banker who lends it at interest, so that this part is in circulation. Or else the property owner spends a large part of it on the many things he needs for his household. He may even borrow money before he gets his next quarter's rent. Thus, the money of the first quarter's rent will circulate in 1,000 ways before it's accumulated by the farmer to make his second quarter payment. When it comes time to pay the second quarter rent, the farmer will sell his products in large amounts. Those who buy his cattle, wheat, hay, etc. will already have collected the price of these goods from their retail sales. Thus, the money of the first quarter will have circulated in the retail trade for nearly 3 months before being collected by the retail dealers and given to the farmer who will use it to make his second quarter payment. It would seem from this that less money would suffice for the circulation in a state than we have assumed. Barter does not require much cash because goods can be evaluated at the market price on the day of delivery. If a brewer supplies a tailor with beer for his family, and if the tailor in turn supplies the brewer with clothes he needs, the only cash needed between these two traders is the amount of the difference between the two transactions. If a merchant in a market town sends commodities to an entrepreneur in the city, and in return the entrepreneur sends the merchant products from the city to be consumed in the country throughout the year, Business between these two dealers and mutual confidence leads them to account for their commodities and merchandise at their respective market prices, and the only money needed for this commerce will be the balance that one owes to the other at the end of the year. Even then, this balance may be carried forward to the next year without the actual payment of any money. All the entrepreneurs of a city who continually do business with each other may practice this method. Barter exchange by valuation does seem to reduce the cash in circulation, or at least to accelerate its movement by making it unnecessary when people have confidence in each other and can use this method of exchange by valuation. It is not without reason, as is commonly said, that trust in commerce makes money less scarce. Goldsmiths and bankers, whose tickets serve as payment like coin money, also add to the speed of circulation, which would be retarded if money was required for payments where tickets now suffice. And although these goldsmiths and bankers always keep on hand a large part of the coin money they have received for their tickets, they also put into circulation a considerable amount of this effective money, as I shall explain later when dealing with public banks. All these reflections seem to prove that the circulation in a state could be conducted with much less coin money than what I previously assumed was necessary. However, the following inductions appear to counterbalance them and to contribute to the slowing down of circulation. I will first observe that all commodities are produced by labor that may possibly, strictly speaking, be carried on with little or no actual money, as I have often suggested. But the workers who make goods in cities or market towns must be paid in coin money. If a house has cost 100,000 ounces of silver to build, all this sum, or most of it, must have been paid in small amounts on a weekly basis to the brickmaker, masons, carpenters, etc., directly or indirectly. The expenditures of small families, which are always more numerous in cities, must be made with coin money. With such small purchases, credit, barter, and tickets, like banknotes, do not work. Merchants and entrepreneurs demand cash for the things they supply, and if they give credit to a family for a few days or months, they require a substantial down payment. A wagon builder who sells a wagon for 400 ounces of silver in notes will have to convert them into coin money to pay for all the materials and the men who have worked on the wagon if they have worked on credit. If he has paid them already, the money will be used to pay them to start working on a new one. The sale of the wagon will leave him the profit of his enterprise, and he will spend this profit to maintain his family. He could not be satisfied with notes unless he can afford to put something aside or deposit it to earn interest. The consumption of the inhabitants of a state is, in a sense, entirely for food. Lodging, clothing, furniture, etc. correspond to the food of the men who have worked upon them, and in the cities, all beverages and food are necessarily paid for in coin money. In the families of landowners who live in the city, food is paid for every day or every week. In their families, wine is paid for every week or every month. Hats, stockings, shoes, etc. are ordinarily paid for in coin money. At least the payments correspond to cash for the men who have worked upon them. All the sums used to make large payments are divided, distributed, and spread in small payments, corresponding to the maintenance of the workmen, servants, etc. And all these sums are necessarily collected and reunited by the entrepreneurs and retailers, who are employed in providing the subsistence of the inhabitants to make large payments when they buy commodities from the farmers. An alehouse keeper collects by sols and livres the sums he pays to the brewer, who uses them to pay for all the grain and materials he buys from the country. One cannot imagine that anything could be purchased for cash in a state, like furniture, merchandise, etc., at a value that does not correspond to the maintenance of those who have produced it. Circulation in the cities is carried out by entrepreneurs and always corresponds, directly or indirectly, to the subsistence of the servants, workmen, etc. It is inconceivable that the circulation in small retail businesses could be conducted without cash. Notes may serve as counters in large payments for a certain time, but when the large sums come to be distributed and spread into small transactions, as is always the case sooner or later in the course of circulation in a city, notes cannot serve this purpose, and cash is needed. All this presupposes that all the classes in a state who practice some economy save and keep out of circulation small amounts of cash until they have enough to invest at interest or profit. Many miserly and timid people will bury and hoard cash for considerable periods of time. Many property owners, entrepreneurs, and others always keep some cash in their pockets or safes so that they do not run out of money and to protect them against unforeseen emergencies. If a gentleman says that he never has less than 20 louis in his pocket throughout the whole year, it may be said that his pocket has kept 20 louis out of circulation for a year. No one likes to spend their last penny or to be completely without money. People like to receive a new payment before paying debt, even if they have money. The funds of minors and of litigants are often deposited in cash and kept out of circulation. Beside the large quarterly payments that pass through the hands of farmers, there are wholesale transactions between entrepreneurs and payments from borrowers to lenders that occur at different times. All these sums are collected in the retail trade, are dispersed again, only to come back to the farmer sooner or later. However, they would seem to require a larger amount of cash for circulation than if these large payments were made at times different from those when the farmers are paid for their commodities. In conclusion, there is such a great variety in the organization of the inhabitants in the state and in the corresponding circulation of coin money that it seems impossible to lay down anything precise or exact about the proportion of money sufficient for circulation. I have produced so many examples and inductions which make it clear that I am not far from the truth in my conclusion that actual money necessary for the circulation of the state corresponds nearly to the value of the third of all the annual rents of the property owners. When the owners have a rent that amounts to half the production, or more than a third, a greater quantity of coin money is needed for circulation, other things being equal. When there is great confidence in the banks and in book credits, or when the speed of circulation is accelerated in any way, less money will suffice. However, I shall show later that public banks do not bring as many advantages as is usually assumed. Chapter 5. On the Inequality of the Circulation of Money in a State. Abstract. Rural France was impoverished because commodities had to be sent to the capital and major cities to pay taxes to the state and rents to the property owners living there. It is argued here that if factories were permitted in rural areas, basic commodities could be turned into goods, which could then be sent to the cities at a much lower transport cost. This would save resources in transportation and benefit both rural populations and property owners. The city always supplies various goods to the country, and the property owners who reside in the city should always receive about 1/3 of the production of their land. The country thus owes to the city more than half the production of the land. This debt would always exceed 1/2 if all property owners lived in the city, but because most owners with less significant landholdings live in the country, I suppose that the balance or debt, which continually returns from the country to the city, is equal to half the production of the land and is paid to the city with half of the commodities transported from the countryside and sold to pay this debt. The countryside of a state or kingdom owes a constant balance to the capital to pay rents to the great property owners who reside there, and to pay taxes to the state or crown, most of which are spent in the capital. All the provincial cities owe a constant balance to the capital for the state's property and consumption taxes and for the different goods that they obtain from the capital. It is also the case that several individuals and property owners who live in the provincial cities will spend some time in the capital for pleasure or for the judgment of their lawsuits in final appeal, or because they send their children there for an elite education. Consequently, all these expenses incurred in the capital are drawn from the provincial cities. It may therefore be said that all the countryside and cities of a state regularly owe an annual balance or debt to the capital. However, because such payments are made in money, it is clear that the provinces always owe considerable sums to the capital. The products and commodities that the provinces send to the capital are sold to pay for these debts and balances. Now assume that the circulation of money in the provinces and in the capital is equal, both in terms of the quantity of money and the speed of circulation. The balance will be first sent to the capital in cash, and this will decrease the quantity of money in the provinces and increase it in the capital. Consequently, products and goods will be more expensive in the capital than in the provinces because of the greater abundance of money in the capital. The difference between the prices in the capital and the provinces must pay for the costs and risks of transport, Otherwise, cash will be sent to the capital to pay the balance, and this will continue until the differences in prices between the capital and the provinces cover the costs and risks of transport. Then, the merchants and entrepreneurs of the market towns will buy the products of the villages at a low price and will have them transported to the capital to be sold at a higher price. This difference in price will of necessity pay for the maintenance of the horses and employees of the entrepreneur, plus profit, or else he would cease his enterprise. As a result, the price of farm products of equal quality will always be higher in areas that are close to the capital than in those more distant in proportion to the cost and risks of transport. In addition, areas that are adjacent to seas and rivers flowing into the capital will get a better price for their products relative to those which are distant, other things being equal, because water transport is considerably less expensive than land transport. On the other hand, there are certain foods and goods that cannot be consumed in the capital because they are not suitable or cannot be sent there on account of their bulk or because they would be spoiled on the way. These will be infinitely cheaper in the country and distant provinces than in the capital, because of the much smaller amount of money in circulation in the distant provinces. Therefore, fresh eggs, game, fresh butter, firewood, etc. will generally be much cheaper in the province of Poitou, while wheat, cattle, and horses will be more expensive in Paris, the difference being the cost and risk of transport and the fees for entering the city. It would be easy to make an infinite number of inductions of the same kind to justify by experience the necessity of an inequality in the circulation of money in the different provinces of a great state or kingdom, and to show that this inequality is always relative to the balance or debt, which belongs to the capital. If we assume that the balance owed to the capital amounts to 1/4 of the production of the land of all the provinces of the state, the best use that can be made of the land would be to employ the country bordering on the capital to produce the kind of products which could not be drawn from distant provinces without much expense or deterioration. This is in fact what always takes place. The market prices in the capital regulate how the farmers employ the land for this or that purpose. They use the closest lands, when suitable, for market gardens, pasture, etc. Therefore, when possible, factories for cloth, linen, lace, etc. ought to be set up in remote provinces, and factories to make tools of iron, tin, copper, etc. should be located in the neighborhood of coal mines or forests, which are otherwise useless because of their distance. In this way, finished manufactured goods can be sent to the capital with much lower transportation cost than by sending the raw materials to be manufactured in the capital, as well as the subsistence of the artisans who manufacture them. This would save a large quantity of horses and transport workers who could be better employed for the benefit of the state. The land could serve to maintain the nearby workmen and useful artisans, and a multitude of horses could be saved that are now used for unnecessary transportation. In this way, the remote areas would yield higher rents to property owners, and the inequality of circulation between the provinces and the capital would be considerably less and better proportioned. Nevertheless, to set up manufacturing in this way requires not only much encouragement and capital funds, but also some way to ensure a regular and constant demand, either in the capital itself or in foreign countries. Exports to foreign countries serve the capital by either paying for the goods it imports or with the money it gets in return. When these factories are established, perfection is not attained immediately. If some other province produces the goods better or cheaper, or has an advantage in transportation costs because it's closer to the capital, or can resort to river and sea transportation, the new manufacturers will not succeed. All these circumstances have to be considered when setting up a factory. My intention in this essay is not to explain these issues, but only to suggest that so far as practicable, significant manufacturing should be set up in provinces far from the capital to produce a less unequal distribution of money between rural areas and the capital. For when a distant province has no factory and produces only ordinary foodstuffs and is without water communication to the capital or the ocean, it is surprising how scarce money is compared to that which circulates in the capital, and how little revenue the prince and the property owners who reside in the capital receive from even their best lands. The wines of Provence and Languedoc that are sent to the north must be sent on the long and difficult route around the Straits of Gibraltar, and after having passed through the hands of several entrepreneurs, yield very little to the property owners living in Paris. However, these distant provinces must send their commodities to the capital or elsewhere, either within the state or to foreign countries, despite all the disadvantages of transport and distance, in order to pay the balance owed to the capital. If there were rural factories to pay this balance, the commodities would be mostly consumed locally, and in that case, the rural population would be much larger. When a province pays its balance only with commodities that yield little in the capital because of transport costs, it is clear that the property owners living in the capital give up the production of a large amount of land in the country to receive little in the capital. This arises from the inequality of money, and this inequality results from the constant balance owed to the capital by the province. Currently, if a state or kingdom supplies foreign countries with goods from its own factories and does enough of this commerce to draw in a constant balance of money from abroad every year, money will be more plentiful and the circulation will become more substantial than in foreign countries. And consequently, land and labor will gradually command a higher price. It therefore follows that in all the branches of commerce, this state will exchange a smaller amount of land and labor with the foreigner for a larger amount, so long as these circumstances continue. But if a foreigner resides in the state in question, he will be in roughly the same situation and circumstances as the citizen of Paris who owns land in distant provinces. Beginning in 1646, factories for making cloth and other goods were built in France, and it appeared to trade, at least in part, in the way I described. Since the decay of France, England has taken possession of this trade, and all states appear to flourish by it to a larger or lesser extent. The inequality of the circulation of money in the different states represents the inequality of their comparative power. Other things being equal, and this inequality of circulation is always related to the balance of foreign trade. It is easy to judge from what has been said in this chapter that the assessment of taxes by the royal tithe, as suggested by Mr. de Vauban, would be neither advantageous nor practical. If taxes on land were levied in money in proportion to the rents of the property owners, it would be fairer. But I must not stray from my subject to show the inconveniences and impossibility of Mr. de Vauban's proposal. Chapter 6. The Increase and Decrease of the Quantity of Money in a State. Abstract. Here Cantillon uses his price-specie flow mechanism to analyze some of the effects of inflation. Increasing the supply of money by mining hurts some people and benefits others because certain prices and incomes rise faster than others. However, if the new money is accumulated and saved by those who successfully export goods, either because of superior quality or more efficient transportation, it will lead to higher standards of living. If gold or silver mines were found in a state and considerable quantities of minerals were extracted from them, the owners of these mines, the entrepreneurs, and all those who work there will increase their expenditures in proportion to the wealth and profit they make. They will also lend the money they have over and above what they need for their expenses and earn interest. All this money, whether lent or spent, will enter into circulation and will not fail to raise the price of commodities and goods in all the channels of circulation it enters. Increased money will bring about increased expenditure, and this will cause an increase of market prices in the good years and to a lesser degree in bad years. Everybody agrees that the abundance of money or an increase in its use in exchange raises the price of everything. This truth is substantiated in experience by the quantity of money brought to Europe from America for the last 2 centuries. Mr. Locke lays it down as a fundamental maxim that the quantity of goods in proportion to the quantity of money is a regulator of market prices. I have tried to elucidate his idea in the preceding chapters. He has clearly seen that the abundance of money makes everything more expensive, but he has not considered how this happens. The great difficulty of this question consists in knowing in what way and in what proportion the increase of money raises the prices of things. I have already noted that acceleration or a greater pace in the circulation of money in exchange is equivalent to, to a certain degree, an increase of actual money. I have also noted that an increase or decrease of prices in a distant market, domestic or foreign, influences the local market prices. On the other hand, money flows through so many retail channels that it seems impossible not to lose sight of it, seeing that, having been amassed to make large sums, it is distributed in small amounts in exchange and then gradually accumulated again to make large payments. For these operations, it is necessary to constantly exchange between gold, silver, and copper money, according to the requirements of exchange. It is also usually the case that the increase or decrease of hard money in a state is not perceived because it comes into a state from foreign countries by such imperceptible means and proportions that it is impossible to know exactly the quantity which enters or leaves the state. However, all these operations happen before our eyes and everybody takes a direct part in them. I therefore venture to offer a few observations on the subject, even though I may not be able to give an exact and precise account. In general, an increase of hard money in a state will cause a corresponding increase in consumption, and this will gradually produce increased prices. If the increase of hard money comes from gold and silver mines within the state, the owner of these mines, the entrepreneurs, the smelters, refiners, and all the other workers will increase their expenses in proportion to their profits. Their households will consume more meat, wine, or beer than before. They will become accustomed to wearing better clothes, having finer linens, and to having more ornate houses and other desirable goods. Consequently, they will give employment to several artisans who did not have that much work before, and who, for the same reason, will increase their expenditures. All this increased expenditures on meat, wine, wool, etc. necessarily reduces the share of the other inhabitants in the state who do not participate at first in the wealth of the mines in question. The bargaining process of the market, with the demand for meat, wine, wool, etc. being stronger than usual, will not fail to increase their prices. These high prices will encourage farmers to employ more land to produce the following year, and these same farmers will profit from the increased prices and will increase their expenditure on their families like the others. Those who will suffer from these higher prices and increased consumption will be, first of all, the property owners during the term of their leases, then their domestic servants and all the workmen or fixed wage earners who support their family on a salary. They all must diminish their expenditures in proportion to the new consumption, which will compel a large number of them to emigrate and to seek a living elsewhere. The property owners will dismiss many of them, and the rest will demand a wage increase in order to live as before. It is in this manner that a considerable increase of money from mines increases consumption, and by diminishing the number of inhabitants, greater expenditures result by those who remain. If money continues to be extracted from the mines, the abundance of money will increase all prices to such a point that not only will the property owners raise their rents considerably when the leases expire and resume their old lifestyle, increasing their servants' wages proportionally, but the artisans and workmen will increase the prices of the articles they produce so high that there will be a considerable gains in buying them from foreigners who make them much cheaper. This will naturally encourage several people to import products at lower prices from foreign factories, and this will gradually ruin the artisans and manufacturers of the state who will be unable to sustain themselves by working at such low rates because of the high cost of living. When the overabundance of money from the mines has diminished, the number of inhabitants in a state, accustom those who remain to excessive expenditures, raise the prices of farm products and the wages for labor to high levels, and ruin the manufactures of the state by the purchase of foreign products by property owners and mine workers, the money produced by the mines will necessarily go abroad to pay for the imports. This will gradually impoverish the state and make it, in a way, dependent on foreigners to whom it is obliged to send money every year, as it is extracted from the mines. The great circulation of money, which was widespread in the beginning, ceases. Poverty and misery follow, and the exploitation of the mines appears to be only advantageous to those employed in them and to the foreigners who profit thereby. This is approximately what has happened to Spain since the discovery of the Indies. As for the Portuguese, since the discovery of gold mines in Brazil, they have nearly always used foreign articles and manufactured goods, and it seems that they work the mines only for the account and advantage of foreigners. All the gold and silver that these two states extract from the mines does not supply them with more precious metal in circulation than others. England and France usually have even more. Now, if the increase of money in the state comes from a balance of foreign trade, i.e. from sending abroad articles and manufactured goods of greater value and quantity than is imported and consequently receiving the surplus of money, this annual increase of money will enrich a great number of merchants and entrepreneurs in the state and will give employment to numerous artisans and workmen who provide the goods sent to the foreigner from whom the money is drawn. This will gradually increase the consumption of these industrious inhabitants and will raise the price of land and labor. But the industrious people who are eager to acquire property will not at first increase their expenditures. They will wait until they have accumulated a large sum from which they can draw a secure interest income independent of their occupation. Once a large number of inhabitants have acquired considerable fortunes from this money, which enters the state regularly and annually, they will not fail to increase their consumption and raise the price of everything. Although these higher prices result in greater expenditures than they at first contemplated, they will, for the most part, continue so long as their capital lasts, for nothing is easier or more pleasant than to increase the family expenditures, and nothing is more difficult or unpleasant than to decrease them. If an annual and continuous balance has caused a considerable increase of money in a state, it will not fail to increase consumption, raise the price of everything, and even diminish the number of inhabitants unless additional products are drawn from abroad proportionate to the increased consumption. Moreover, in states that have acquired a considerable abundance of money, it is natural to import many goods from neighboring countries where money is rare, and consequently everything is cheap. However, as money must be exchanged for these products, the balance of trade will become smaller. The cheapness of land and labor in foreign countries where money is rare will naturally cause the building of factories and businesses similar to those of the state, but which will not, at first, be as perfect or as highly valued. In this situation, the state can retain its abundance of money, consume all its own products and a great deal of foreign products, and over and above all this, maintain a small balance of trade against the foreigner, or at least keep the balance leveled for many years. In other words, the state will import, in exchange for its commodities and manufactured goods, as much money from these foreign countries as it sends to them for the goods or products of the land it takes from them. If the state is a maritime state, the easiness and low cost of its shipping for the transport of its commodities and manufactured goods to foreign countries may compensate in some way for the high cost of labor caused by the overabundance of money. Therefore, the commodities and manufactured goods of the state, expensive though they may be, will continue to sell in foreign countries, and sometimes will be cheaper than the manufactured goods of another state where labor is paid less. The cost of transport greatly increases the price of goods sent to distant countries. However, these costs are very moderate in maritime states where there is regular shipping to all foreign ports and ships are nearly always found there ready to sail, taking on board all cargoes entrusted to them at a very reasonable freight. This is not so in states where navigation does not flourish. There, it is necessary to build ships especially for the transportation of goods, and this sometimes absorbs all the profit, and the transportation there is always very expensive, which entirely discourages commerce. England today consumes not only most of its own small production, but also a large amount of foreign products such as silks, wines, fruit, linen in great quantity, etc. Meanwhile, she sends abroad the products of her mines and manufactured goods for the most part. No matter how expensive labor is due to the abundance of money, she does not fail to sell her products to distant countries, because of her maritime advantage, at prices as reasonable as those of France, where these same products are cheaper. The increased quantity of money in a state may also be caused without a balance of trade, by subsidies paid to this state by foreign powers, by the expenditures of several ambassadors or travelers wanting to stay there for political reasons, curiosity, or pleasure, or by the transfer of the property and wealth of families who choose to leave the country to seek religious freedom, or for other reasons, and to settle down in this state. In all these cases, the sums entering the state always cause an increase in expenditures and consumption, and consequently increase the prices of all goods in the channels of exchange where money enters. Before the increase in the quantity of money, suppose that a quarter of the inhabitants of the state consume meat, wine, beer, etc., on a daily basis, and frequently acquire clothes, linens, etc. but that after the increase, a third or a half of the inhabitants consume these same things. Prices for these goods will increase, and the high price of meat will convince several of those who formed the original quarter to consume less meat than usual. A man who eats 3 pounds of meat daily will manage with 2 pounds, but he feels the reduction. Meanwhile, the other half of the inhabitants who hardly ate any meat at all will not feel the reduction. The price of bread will increase gradually because of increased consumption, as I have often suggested, but it will be proportionally less expensive than meat. The increase in the price of meat is noticeably felt because it causes a reduction in consumption on the part of a small portion of the people, but the increased price of bread is less noticeable because the decreased consumption is spread across the entire population. If 100,000 extra people move to a state with 10 million inhabitants, their extra consumption of bread will amount to only 1 pound in 100, which must be subtracted from the old inhabitants. But when a man consumes 99 pounds of bread for his subsistence instead of 100, he hardly feels the reduction. When the consumption of meat increases, farmers increase the size of their pastures to produce more meat, and this diminishes cropland, and consequently the amount of wheat produced. However, what generally causes meat to become proportionally more expensive than bread is that the imports of foreign wheat are usually permitted, while imports of beef are absolutely forbidden, as is the case in England, where heavy import duties are imposed as in other states. This is the reason why the rents for meadows and pastures rise in England, with the abundance of money, 3 times more than the rents of cropland. There is no doubt that when ambassadors, travelers, and families move to a state, the increased consumption will cause higher prices in all the markets where they spend their money. As for the subsidies the state has received from foreign powers, they are either hoarded for state necessities or are put into circulation. If we assume they are hoarded, they do not concern my argument, for I am considering only money in circulation. Hoarded money, silverware, churches' money, etc. are resources that the state turns to in emergency situations, but are of no present utility. If the state puts these funds into circulation, it can only do so by spending them, and this will certainly increase consumption and raise the price of all goods. Whoever receives this money will set it in motion the principal business of life, which is the food, either for himself or someone else, since everything is connected to this directly or indirectly. Chapter 7. More on the increase and decrease in the quantity of money in a state. Abstract. When there is an increase in the quantity of money, prices will increase depending on how the new money holders decide to spend their money. The price changes will also be affected by such things as regulations on trade and the perishability of the products that are traded. In other words, the simple quantity theory of money is naive in proposing that a doubling of the quantity of money would double all prices equally. Changes in the quantity of money will change relative prices and have real effects on the economy, a phenomenon now known as the Cantillon effects. Where gold, silver, and copper are extracted from the mines, they have an intrinsic value proportional to the land and labor that enter into their production. States that have no mines have the added costs of importing the metal. The quantity of money, like that of all other commodities, determines its value against all other goods in the bargaining process of the marketplace. If England begins for the first time to make use of gold, silver, and copper in exchanges, money will be valued according to the quantity in circulation, proportionally to its power of exchange against all other merchandise and products. The bargaining process of the market will determine this estimation of value. On the basis of this estimation, the property owners and entrepreneurs will set the wages of the domestic servants and workmen at so much a day or a year, so that they and their families may be able to live on the wages they receive. Let us now assume that because of ambassadors and foreign travelers residing in England, as much money has been introduced into circulation as there was before, thereby doubling the quantity of money. This money will pass first into the hands of various artisans, servants, entrepreneurs, and others who have had a share in providing transportation, amusements, etc. for these foreigners. Manufacturers, farmers, and other entrepreneurs will feel the effect of the increased money, which will increase the expenditures of a great number of people, and this will, in turn, increase market prices. Even the children of these entrepreneurs and artisans will enter into new expenditures. With this abundance of money, their fathers will give them a little money for their petty pleasures, and they will buy cakes and meat pies, etc. This new quantity of money will be distributed so that many who lived without using money before will now have some. Many exchanges which used to be made on credit by valuation will now be made with cash, and that will increase the pace of the circulation of money in England compared to before. I conclude from all this that by doubling the quantity of money in a state, the prices of products and merchandise are not always doubled. The river which runs and winds about in its bed will not flow with double the speed when the amount of water is doubled. The change in relative prices introduced by the increased quantity of money in the state will depend on how this money is directed at consumption and circulation. No matter who obtains the new money, it will naturally increase consumption. However, this consumption will be greater or less according to circumstances. It will more or less be directed to certain kinds of commodities or merchandise according to the judgment of those who acquire the money. Market prices will increase more for certain goods than for others, however abundant the money may be. In England, the price of meat might triple, but the price of wheat might increase less than 1/4. In England, it is still permitted to import wheat from foreign countries, but not cattle. For this reason, however great the increase of money may be in England, the price of wheat can only be raised above the price in other countries where money is scarce by the costs and risk of importing wheat from these foreign countries. It is not the same with the price of cattle, which will necessarily be proportioned to the quantity of money offered for meat in relation to the quantity of meat and the number of cattle raised there. An ox weighing 800 pounds sells in Poland and Hungary for 2 or 3 ounces of silver, but commonly sells in the London market for more than 40. Yet the bushel of flour does not sell in London for even double the price in Poland and Hungary. An increase of money only increases the prices of commodities and merchandise by the difference of the cost of transport when this transport is allowed. But in many cases, transportation would cost more than the good is worth. Therefore, for example, timber is useless in many places. This cost of transportation is also the reason why milk, fresh butter, lettuce, game, etc. are almost given away in the provinces distant from the capital. I conclude that an increase of actual money in a state always causes an increase of consumption and a routine of greater expenditures. But the higher prices caused by this money does not affect all commodities and merchandise equally. Prices do not rise proportionally to the quantity of money unless what has been added continues in the same circulation channels as before. In other words, those who offered 1 ounce of silver in the market would be the same and only ones to offer 2 ounces when the amount of money in circulation is doubled, and that is hardly ever the case. I recognize that when a large surplus of money is introduced in a state, the new money gives a new direction to consumption and even a new speed to circulation. However, it is not possible to say exactly to what extent. Chapter 8. Further reflections on the increase and decrease of money in a state. Abstract. Increases in the supply of money from a balance of trade eventually cause prices to rise. This in turn puts pressure on domestic producers and increases imports. The result is that the balance of trade is reduced and eventually is negative. This is Cantillon's price-specie flow mechanism, which demonstrates the reasons for the tendency for equilibrium in international monetary flows. The balance of trade can result in economic power, but this also causes the economy to lapse into luxury and decline. We have seen that the quantity of money circulating in a state may be increased by working its mines, by subsidies from foreign powers, by the immigration of foreign families, by the residence of ambassadors and travelers, but above all, by a regular and annual balance of trade, from supplying goods to foreigners and by receiving from them at least part of the price in gold and silver. It is by this last means that a state grows most substantially, especially when its trade is accompanied and supported by ample shipping and by a significant output of the raw materials necessary for the production of exported manufactured goods. However, the continuation of this commerce gradually introduces a great abundance of money and little by little increases consumption. Foreign products must be imported to meet this demand and must be paid for by a reduction in the annual balance of trade. On the other hand, increased expenditures increase the cost of labor and the prices of manufactured goods. It often happens that some foreign countries try to set up the same kinds of factories for themselves, in which case they stop buying those of the state in question. Although these newly established factories and manufacturers are not perfect at first, they reduce and even prevent the export of those goods from the neighboring state into their own country, where they can be acquired at a better price. In this manner, the state begins to lose some branches of its profitable trade, and many of its workmen and artisans who lose their jobs will leave the state to find employment in new foreign factories. In spite of this diminution in the balance of trade, the custom of importing various products will continue. If the manufactured products of a state have a great reputation and can be shipped to distant countries at low cost, the state will maintain its advantage over the new foreign manufacturers for many years and will maintain a small balance of trade, or at least keep it even. If, however, some other maritime state tries to perfect the same articles and its navigation at the same time, it will, because of the cheapness of its manufactures, take away several branches of trade from the state in question. Consequently, this state will begin to lose its balance of trade and will be forced to send a part of its money abroad every year in order to pay for its imports. Moreover, even if the state in question could keep a balance of trade and its greater abundance of money, it is reasonable to suppose that this abundance will plunge many wealthy individuals into luxury. They will buy paintings, precious stones from abroad, they will want silks and rare objects, and they set such an example of luxury in the state that in spite of the advantage of its ordinary trade, its money will flow abroad annually to pay for this luxury. This will gradually impoverish the state and cause it to pass from great power to great weakness. When a state has arrived at the highest point of wealth, and I always assume that the comparative wealth of states consists mainly in their respective quantities of money, it will inevitably fall back into poverty by the ordinary course of things. The too great abundance of money, which gives power to states so long as it lasts, throws them back imperceptibly, but naturally, into poverty. Thus it would seem that when a state expands by trade, and the abundance of money raises the price of land and labor, the prince or the legislator ought to withdraw money from circulation, keep it for emergencies, and try to slow down its circulation by every means, except compulsion and bad faith, to prevent its goods from becoming too expensive and avoid the drawbacks of luxury. However, it is not easy to perceive the opportune time for this, or to know when money has become more abundant than it ought to be for the good and preservation of the advantages of the state. Therefore, princes and heads of republics do not concern themselves much with this sort of knowledge, and strive only to make use of the abundance of their state revenues to extend their power and to insult other countries on the most frivolous pretexts. All things considered, working to perpetuate the glory of their reigns and administration, and to leaving monuments of their power and wealth, is perhaps the best they can do, because according to the natural course of humanity, the state must collapse on its own. They only accelerate its fall a little. Nevertheless, it seems that they should try to make their power last during the time of their own administration. Few years are needed to raise abundance to the highest point in a state. However, still fewer are needed to bring it to poverty for lack of commerce and manufacturing. Without speaking of the rise and fall of the Venice Republic, Hanseatic cities, Flanders and Brabant, the Dutch Republic, etc., who have succeeded each other in profitable branches of trade, one may say that France's power has only been on the rise from 1646, when factories were established to produce clothing which had previously been imported, to 1684, when a number of Protestant entrepreneurs and artisans were driven out of France. That kingdom has done nothing but recede since this last date. I know no better measure than the leases and rents of property owners to judge the abundance and scarcity of money in circulation. When land is leased at high rates, it is a sign that there is plenty of money in the state. But when land has to be leased at much lower rates, it shows, other things being equal, that money is scarce. I have read in The State of France that acres of vineyards near Mantes, not far from the French capital, which leased for 200 livres tournois of full weight in 1660, only leased for 100 livres tournois of lighter money in 1700. However, the silver bought from the West Indies in the interval should naturally have raised the price of land in Europe. The author of The State of France attributes this fall in rent to defective consumption. In fact, it seems that he observed a reduction in wine consumption. However, I think he has mistaken the effect for the cause. The cause was a greater rarity of money in France, and the effect of this was naturally a decrease in consumption. In this essay, I have always suggested, on the contrary, that an abundance of money naturally increases consumption and contributes above everything else to a higher valuation of the land. When abundant money raises products to honest prices, the inhabitants eagerly work to acquire them, although they do not show the same eagerness to acquire food and merchandise beyond what is needed for their maintenance. It is clear that a state with more money in circulation than its neighbors has an advantage over them, so long as it maintains this abundance of money. In the first place, given that the price of land and labor are calculated in terms of money, the state where money is most abundant will give up less land and labor than it receives in all areas of trade. Thus, the state in question sometimes receives the product of 2 acres of land in exchange for that of 1 acre, and the work of 2 men for that of only 1. It is because of this abundance of money in circulation in London that the work of 1 English embroiderer costs more than that of 10 Chinese embroiderers, though the Chinese embroider much better and turn out more work in a day. In Europe, people are amazed that these people can live by working so cheap and that the wonderful fabrics they send us cost so little. Secondly, tax revenues are more easily raised in a state where money is plentiful and in relatively larger amounts. This gives the state, in case of war or dispute, the means to gain all sorts of advantages over its adversaries with whom money is scarce. If there are 2 princes at war over the sovereignty or conquest of a state, where one has much money and the other has little money, but many estates worth twice the money of his enemy, the first will be better able to attract generals and officers with gifts of money than the second will be able by giving twice the value in lands and estates. Grants of land are subject to challenge and revocation and cannot be relied upon like money. With money, munitions of war and food can be bought, even from the enemies of the state. Money can be given for secret services without witnesses, but land, produce, and goods would not serve for these purposes, not even jewels or diamonds, because they are easily recognized. After all, it seems to me that the comparative power and wealth of states consists, other things being equal, in the greater or less abundance of money circulating in them hic et nunc. I still have to mention 2 other methods of increasing the amount of money circulating in a state. The first is when entrepreneurs and private individuals borrow money from their foreign correspondents at interest, or when foreigners send their money into the state to buy shares or government stocks. This often amounts to very considerable sums on which the state must annually pay interest to these foreigners. These methods for increasing money in the state do make it more abundant and diminish the rate of interest. With this money, the entrepreneurs in the state find it possible to borrow more cheaply, to provide work, and to establish factories with the anticipation of a profit. The artisans, and all those whose hands this money passes through, consume more than they would have done if they had not been employed by means of this money. This consequently increases prices just as if the money belonged to the state, and through the increased consumption or expenditures this causes, public revenues derived from taxes on consumption are increased. Money lent to the state in this manner brings many advantages with it, but in the end, it is always burdensome and harmful. The state must pay the interest to the foreigners every year, and aside from this loss, the state is at the mercy of the foreigners who can always cause trouble if they decide to withdraw their capital. Surely they will want to withdraw their capital when the state needs it the most, and when preparing for war and defeat is feared. The interest paid to the foreigner is always much more considerable than the interest in public revenue caused by this money. One can observe these loans passing from one country to another according to investors' confidence in the states to which they are sent. But in reality, states that have paid heavy interest on these loans for many years will often find themselves bankrupt and unable to repay the capital. When trust is shaken, shares or public schools fall. Foreign shareholders do not like to sustain losses, preferring to content themselves with collecting interest while waiting for confidence to return. But sometimes it does not return. In declining states, the principal objective of public administrators usually is to restore confidence in order to attract foreign loans. If the ministry does not act in bad faith and keeps its obligations, the money of the subjects will circulate without interruption. In this case, money from abroad has the power of increasing the quantity of money in a state. But the borrowing road, which holds an advantage in the present, leads to a dead end and is but a flash in the pan. To restore a poor state with a shortage of money, a constant and real balance of trade is needed on an annual basis, as is the development, through navigation, of the articles and manufactures produced cheaper and thereby suitable for exportation. Merchants are the first to make their fortunes, then the lawyers may get a part of it. The prince and tax collectors get a share at the expense of all others and distribute their graces as they please. When money becomes too plentiful in a state, luxury will follow and the state will fall into poverty. This is roughly the cycle that may be experienced by a large state which has both capital and industrious inhabitants. A talented public administrator is always able to begin the cycle over again. Not many years are needed to see it tried and succeed, at least in the beginning, which makes for the most interesting situation. The increased quantity of money in circulation will be brought about by several factors that my argument does not allow me to examine now. As for states without much capital, and where capital can only be increased by accidents or by particular circumstances of the times, it is difficult to find the means that would allow them to flourish by trade. No administrator can restore the republics of Venice and Holland to the brilliant situation from which they have fallen. But Italy, Spain, France, and England, however poor they may be, are still capable of attaining a high degree of power by trade alone if led by a good administration, and if they operate separately. If all these states were equally well administered, they would be great only in proportion to their respective capital and to the greater or lesser industriousness of their people. The last method I can think of to increase the quantity of money actually circulating in a state is by violence and arms. And this method is often blended with the others, since in all peace treaties one will try to maintain trading rights and other privileges one could obtain. When a state mandates contributions or makes several other states tributary to it, this is a very sure method of obtaining their money. I will not examine the methods of putting this theory into practice, but I will say that all the nations who have flourished in this manner have not failed to decline, like states that have flourished through their commerce. The ancient Romans were more powerful in this manner than all the other peoples we know of. Nevertheless, these same Romans, before losing an inch of the land of their vast states, fell into decadence through luxury and impoverished themselves by the reduction of money which circulated among them, and it was this luxury that caused their empire to pass into the hands of the eastern nations of the Orient. So long as Romans' luxury, which did not begin until after the defeat of Antiochus, king of Asia, around AUC 564, came from the product of the land and the labor of all the vast estates of their dominion, the circulation of money only increased instead of decreasing. The public was in possession of all the gold, silver, and copper mines in the empire. They had the gold mines of Asia, Macedonia, Achaia, and the rich mines, both gold and silver, of Spain and other countries. They had several mints where gold, silver, and copper coins were struck. In Rome, the consumption of all the goods and merchandise drawn from their vast provinces did not diminish the circulation of money any more than the pictures, statues, and jewels themselves. Although the wealthy landlords spent excessive amounts for their feasts and paid 15,000 ounces of silver for a single fish, all that did not diminish the quantity of money circulating in Rome, given that the provinces made tributes regularly, not to mention the money brought in by lenders and by governors with their extortions. The amount annually extracted from the mines increased the circulation in Rome during Augustus' whole reign. However, luxury was already on a very great scale, and there was much eagerness not only for curiosities produced in the empire, but also for jewels from India, pepper and spices, and all the rarities of Arabia. Silks which were not made in the empire began to be in demand there. Nevertheless, the money drawn from the mines still exceeded the sums sent out of the empire to buy all these things. However, under Tiberius, money became scarce when that emperor collected 2.7 billion sesterces in his treasury. To restore an abundant circulation, he only needed to borrow 300 million on a mortgage of his estates. After his death, Caligula spent all of Tiberius's treasure in less than 1 year, and it was then that the abundance of money in circulation was at its highest in Rome, and the wind of luxury kept on blowing. The historian Pliny estimated that in his time the empire exported at least 100 million sesterces annually. This was more than was drawn from the mines. Under Trajan, land prices fell by 1/3 or more, according to the younger Pliny, and money continued to decrease until the time of the emperor Septimus Severus. Money was then so scarce in Rome that the emperor collected enormous quantities of wheat, being unable to collect enough tax money for his enterprises. Thus the Roman Empire declined through the loss of its money before losing any of its estates. That is what luxury brought about and what it always will bring about in similar circumstances. Chapter 9. Interest on Money and Its Causes. Abstract. Interest is established in the market by lenders and borrowers, and the interest rate on a particular loan is determined by the risk of default. A loan is repaid from the income generated from capital investments, and the interest paid is equivalent to the profits of fully capitalized enterprises. Small entrepreneurs pay high rates whether they borrow cash or purchase goods to be paid at a later date, based on risk and their propensity to spend beyond their means. Thereby, interest rates on loans are connected with an individual's time preference. Just as the prices of goods are set by the bargaining process in the market and by the quantity of goods offered for sale relative to the quantity of money offered for them, or in other words, by the relative number of sellers and buyers, so in the same way, the interest on loans in a state is settled by the relative number of lenders and borrowers. Although money serves as a medium of exchange, it does not multiply itself or earn interest simply by being in circulation. It is the needs of mankind that seem to have introduced the usage of interest. A man who lends money backed by good securities or a mortgage only runs the risk of the ill will of the borrower or of expenses, lawsuits, and losses. However, when he lends without collateral, he runs the risk of losing everything. For this reason, needy men must have begun by tempting lenders with profit as bait, and this profit must have been proportionate to the needs of the borrowers and the fear and avarice of the lenders. This seems to be the origin of interest, although its continued use in states seem to be based upon the profits that entrepreneurs can make from it. Land aided by human labor naturally produces 4, 10, 20, 50, 100, 150 times the amount of wheat sown, depending on the fertility of the soil and the industry of the inhabitants. It also produces fruits and cattle. The farmer who runs the operation generally keeps 2/3 of the production, with 1/3 paying his expenses and upkeep, and the other being the profit for his enterprise. If the farmer has enough capital for this enterprise, such as the necessary tools, horses for plowing, cattle to increase the value of the land, etc., he will keep for himself, after paying all expenses, 1/3 of the farm's production. But if a competent laborer, who lives on his wages from day to day and who has no land, can find someone willing to lease land or the money to buy some, he will be able to give the lender all of the third rent, or 1/3 of the production of the farm over which he will become the farmer or entrepreneur. However, he will see his condition improved because he will obtain his upkeep in the second rent and will become master instead of employee. If he can save and do without some necessities, he can gradually accumulate some capital and have less to borrow every year. Eventually, he will manage to keep all of the third rent. If this new entrepreneur can buy wheat or cattle on credit that will be paid back long-term when he sells his farm products for money, he will gladly pay more than the cash market price. This is the same thing as if he borrowed cash to buy wheat, with the interest paid being the difference between the cash price and the price payable at a future date. However, whether he borrows cash or goods, there must be enough left over for his upkeep or he will become bankrupt. This risk is the reason why he will be required to pay 20 or 30% profit or interest on the amount of money or value of the goods he borrowed. In a similar manner, a master hat maker who has capital to carry on his manufacture of hats, to rent a house, buy beaver skins, wool, dye, etc., and to pay for the subsistence of his workmen every week, should obtain his own upkeep from this enterprise and a profit similar to that of the farmer who keeps 1/3 of his farm's output as profit. This upkeep and the profit should come from the sale of the hats, the price of which ought to cover not only the materials, but also the upkeep of the hatter and his workmen, and also the profit in question. A capable journeyman hatter with no capital may undertake the same business by borrowing money and materials and giving the profit to anybody who is willing to lend him the money or entrust him with the beaver, wool, etc., for which he will pay sometime later when he has sold his hats. If, when his bills are due, the lender requires his capital back, or if the wool merchant and other lenders will not grant him further credit, he must give up his business, in which case he may prefer to go bankrupt. But if he is prudent and industrious, he may be able to show his creditors that he has, in cash or in hats, about the same value that he has borrowed, and they will probably choose to continue to give him credit and be satisfied, for the time being, with their interest or profit. In this way, he will carry on and will perhaps gradually save some capital by cutting back upon his necessities. In this manner, he will have less to borrow every year, and when he has collected enough capital to conduct his business, which will always be proportional to his sales, he will keep his entire profit and grow rich if he does not increase his expenditures. It is useful to observe that the upkeep of such a manufacturer is small compared to the sums he borrows for his business or to the value of materials entrusted to him. Therefore, the lenders run no great risk of losing their capital if the borrower is respectable and hardworking. However, as he may not be, the lenders will always require a profit or interest of 20 to 30% of the value of their loan. Even then, only those who have a good opinion of him will trust him. The same inductions may be made with regard to all the masters, artisans, manufacturers, and other entrepreneurs in the state who carry on enterprises in which the capital considerably exceeds the value of their annual upkeep. However, if a water carrier in Paris sets himself up as the entrepreneur of his own work, all the capital he needs is the price of 2 buckets, which he can buy for 1 ounce of silver, after which all his gains are profit. If he earns 50 ounces of silver a year by his labor, the amount of his capital or borrowing relative to his profit is 1 to 50. That is, he will earn 5,000%, while the hatter will only earn 50% and will also have to pay 20 or 30% to the lender. Nevertheless, a money lender will prefer to lend 1,000 ounces of silver to a hat maker at 20% interest, rather than lend 1,000 ounces to 1,000 water carriers at 500% interest. The water carriers will quickly spend on their maintenance not only the money they gain by their daily labor, but all that is lent to them. These amounts of capital are small compared with what they need for their maintenance. However much or little they work, they can easily spend all that they earn. Therefore, it is difficult to determine the profitability of small entrepreneurs. It may well be that a water carrier earns 5,000% of the value of the buckets that are the capital of his company. He could even earn 10,000% if by hard work he earns 100 ounces of silver a year. However, because he could easily spend 100 ounces on himself just as easily as 50, it is only by knowing what he devotes to his upkeep that we can determine how much clear profit has been made. It is always necessary to deduct the subsistence and maintenance of the entrepreneur before determining their profit. We have done this in the example of the farmer and of the hat maker. However, we have shown that this is difficult to determine in the case of the smallest entrepreneurs, the majority of whom will eventually go bankrupt. Ordinarily, brewers in London will lend a few kegs of beer to pub owners, and when they pay for the first kegs, they continue to lend them more. If these pubs do a brisk business, the brewers can make an annual profit of 500%. And I have heard that the big brewers grow rich when no more than half the pubs go bankrupt on them in the course of the year. All the merchants in a state are in the habit of lending merchandise or products to retailers. They proportion the amount of their profit or interest to that of their risk. The risk is always considerable when the proportion of the borrower's maintenance is high relative to the amount of the loan. If the borrower or retailer does not have a prompt flow of sales in his small business, he will quickly be ruined and will spend all he has borrowed on his own subsistence and will consequently be forced into bankruptcy. The fish merchant who buys fish at Billingsgate in London to sell again in other areas of the city generally pays, under a contract made by a professional writer, 1 shilling per guinea or per 21 shillings of interest per week, which amounts to 260% per year. The market women in Paris, whose business is smaller, pay 5 sols for the week's interest on a queue of 3 livres, which exceeds 430% per year. And yet, there are few lenders who make a fortune from such high interest. These high rates of interest are not only tolerated, but are in a way useful and necessary in a state. Those who buy fish in the streets pay for these high interest rates with an increase in the price they charge. They provide a convenience for their customers who do not consider it a loss. In the same manner, an artisan who drinks a beer and pays a price that gives the brewer his 500% profit is satisfied with this convenience and does not feel the loss of this small detail. The casuists, who hardly seem suitable to judge the nature of interest in matters of trade, have created a concept, damnum emergens, through which they will tolerate these high interest rates. Rather than disrupt its use and suitability to business, they have agreed to allow those who lend at great risk to charge a proportionally high rate of interest. And there is no limit, for they would be at a loss to find any definite limit, because in reality, this business depends on the fears of the lenders and the needs of the borrowers. Maritime merchants are praised when they can generate a profit from their enterprise's capital, even though it is as high as 10,000%. And whatever profit wholesale merchants make or demand for selling products or merchandise to smaller retail merchants on long credit. I have not heard the casuists declare it a crime. They are, or seem to be, a little more scrupulous about loans of money, even though it is essentially the same thing. They even tolerate these loans by a distinction, lucrum cessans, that they invented. I understand this means that a man who usually makes a 500% profit in his business may demand this rate when he lends money to another. Nothing is more entertaining than the multitude of laws and rules made in every century on the subject of the interest of money, always unnecessarily, by wiseacres who hardly understand the facts of commerce. From these examples and inductions, it seems that there are many classes and pathways of interest or profit in a state. In the lowest classes, interest is always highest in proportion to the greatest risk, and it diminishes from class to class up to the highest, which is that of rich merchants who are known to be creditworthy. The interest stipulated for this class is called the current rate of interest in the state, and it differs little from the interest rate charged on land mortgages. A bill of exchange from a solvent and solid merchant is well regarded, at least in the short run, as a mortgage on land, because the possibility of a lawsuit or a dispute involving the mortgage is equivalent to the possibility of the merchant's bankruptcy. If entrepreneurs in a state could not make a profit on the money or goods that they borrow, the use of interest would probably be less frequent than it is. Only extravagant people and spendthrifts would contract for loans. But accustomed as everyone is to depend on entrepreneurs, there is a constant source for loans and consequently for interest. Entrepreneurs are the ones who cultivate the land and supply bread, meat, clothes, etc. to all the inhabitants of a city. Those who work on wages for these entrepreneurs also seek to set themselves up as entrepreneurs in emulation of each other. The multitude of entrepreneurs is much greater among the Chinese, as they have a lively spirit, a genius for enterprise, and a determination to achieve their goals. There are among them many entrepreneurs whose work here is done by people on fixed wages. They even supply meals for laborers in the fields. It is perhaps this large number of small entrepreneurs and others from the various classes who earn a living from consumption without injuring the consumer that keeps the rate of interest for the highest classes at 30%, while it hardly exceeds 5% in Europe. At Athens in Solon's time, interest was at 18%. In the Roman Republic, it was most commonly 12%, but has also been known to be 48, 20, 8, 6, and its lowest was 4%. It was never so low in the free market as toward the end of the Republic, and under Augustus after the conquest of Egypt. The Emperor Antonius and Alexander Severus only reduced interest to 4% by lending public money on the mortgage of land. Chapter 10. The causes of increases and decreases of the interest rate on money in a state. Abstract. The interest rate is determined by the supply and demand for loanable funds, not the supply of money. Savings and frugality decrease the interest rate while lavish spending increases it. War increases the interest rate. Peace decreases it. Paying off the national debt decreases the interest rate. A positive balance of trade decreases the interest rate, but the government cannot effectively lower the interest rate by a usury law. The interest rate is a critical factor in the valuation of assets such as land. It is a common idea accepted by all those who have written on commerce that an increased quantity of money in a state decreases the rate of interest, because when money is abundant, it is easier to find some to borrow. This idea is not always true or accurate. For proof, we need only to remember that in 1720, nearly all the money in England was brought to London. In addition, the number of notes in circulation further accelerated the movement of money to an extraordinary level. However, this abundance of money and increased circulation did not decrease the interest rate, which had been running at 5% or lower. It only served to raise the rate, which increased up to 50 and 60%. It is easy to account for this increased rate of interest by the principles and the causes of interest that I established in the previous chapter. The reason is that everyone had become an entrepreneur in the South Sea scheme and wanted to borrow money to buy shares, expecting to make an immense profit with which it would be easy to pay this high rate of interest. If the abundance of money in the state comes from the hands of moneylenders, the increase in the number of lenders will probably lower the rate of interest. However, if the abundance comes from the hands of people who will spend it, this will have just the opposite effect and will raise the rate of interest by increasing the number of entrepreneurs who go into business as a result of this increased spending and will need to supply their business by borrowing at all types of interest. The abundance or scarcity of money in a state always raises or lowers the price of everything in markets without any necessary connection to the rates of interest, which may very well be high in states where there is plenty of money and low in those where money is scarcer. High where everything is expensive and low where everything is cheap. High in London, low in Genoa. The rate of interest rises and falls every day from mere rumors, which might decrease or increase the confidence of lenders without affecting the prices of product in markets. The most constant source for a high rate of interest in a state is the great expenditures of nobles, property owners, and other rich people. Entrepreneurs and master craftsmen supply the great houses with all the elements of the spending, and entrepreneurs almost always need to borrow money in order to supply them. When the nobles consume beyond their income and borrow money, they doubly contribute to raising the interest rate. In contrast, when the nobles of the state live frugally and buy firsthand, without middlemen, as often as they can, they will acquire many products from their servants without dealing with entrepreneurs. This diminishes profits and the number of entrepreneurs in the state, and it consequently reduces the number of borrowers as well as the interest rate. Because these entrepreneurs work with their own capital, borrowing as little as they can, and content themselves with small profits, they prevent those who have no capital from starting similar enterprises with borrowed money. Such is the case today in the republics of Genoa and Holland, where interest is sometimes at 2% or lower for the upper classes. Meanwhile, in Germany, Poland, France, Spain, England, and other countries, the affluence and expenses of noblemen and property owners has kept the country's entrepreneurs and master artisans accustomed to large profits, enabling them to pay a high rate of interest, which is higher still when they import everything from abroad with the added risk for the enterprises. When the prince of the state incurs heavy expenses, such as when making war, the rate of interest increases for two reasons. The first is that it increases the number of entrepreneurs with several new large enterprises for war supplies, and it therefore increases borrowing. The second is because of the greater risk that war always brings. On the contrary, when the war is over, risk diminishes, the number of entrepreneurs decrease, and war contractors who go out of business reduce their expenditures and become lenders of the money they have gained. In this situation, if the prince or state offers to repay part of the public debt, it will reduce the rate of interest significantly. This will truly have an effect if part of the debt can be paid off without borrowing elsewhere, because the repayments increase the number of lenders in the highest class of interest, i.e. the prime rate, which will affect all the other classes. When the abundance of money in the state is caused by a continuous, positive balance of trade, this money first passes through the hands of entrepreneurs. And although it increases consumption, it does not fail to lower the rate of interest because most of the entrepreneurs will acquire enough capital to conduct their business without borrowing, and even become lenders of the money they have gained beyond what they need to operate their business. If the state does not have a great number of nobles and rich people who spend lavishly, the abundance of money will certainly lower the interest rate while increasing the price of goods and merchandise exchanged. This is what usually happens in the republics that have neither much capital nor considerable land, and which grow rich only by foreign trade. But in states that have considerable capital and large property owners, the money brought in by foreign trade increases their rents and enables them to spend heavily, which maintains several entrepreneurs and artisans beside those who engage in the foreign trade. This always keeps interest rates high despite the abundance of money. When a noble or property owner ruins himself by extravagant expenditures, the lender who holds the mortgages on the property often acquires the absolute ownership to it. It may also be the case in a state that lenders provide more credit than money in circulation. In this case, they are subordinate owners of the land and its production, which have been mortgaged as security, and without which the lender's capital would be lost by the bankruptcy of the borrower. In the same manner, one may consider the owners of public debt to be the subordinate owners of state revenues, which is used to pay them interest. However, if the legislature was compelled by the needs of the state to use the revenues for other purposes, the owners of public debt would lose everything, while the amount of money circulating in the state would not diminish by a single coin. If the prince or the administrators of the state want to regulate the current interest rate by law, the regulation must be established on the basis of the current market rate in the highest class or thereabout. Otherwise, the law will be useless because entrepreneurs are obedient to the forces of competition or the current price as settled by the proportion of lenders to borrowers, and as a result, they will resort to secret deals. This legal constraint will only hamper trade and raise the interest rate instead of fixing it. Historically, the Romans, after passing several laws to restrict interest rates, passed one to prevent the lending of money altogether. This law had no more success than its predecessors. Justinian's law, which restrained well-to-do people from taking more than 4%, those of a lower order 6%, and traders 8%, was equally amusing and unjust because it was not forbidden to make 50 and 100% profit in all sorts of enterprises. If it is allowable and respectable for a property owner to lease a farm to a poor farmer at a high rent, risking the loss of the rent for a whole year, it seems that it should be permissible for a lender to lend money to a needy borrower at the risk of not only losing his interest or profit, but also his capital, and to stipulate any interest rate that the borrower will freely consent to pay. It is true that loans of this type can make lenders worse off. They can lose both the interest and their capital because they are far less likely to recoup losses compared to the property owner who cannot lose the land he rents. Because bankruptcy laws are relatively favorable to debtors and allow them to start again, it seems that usury laws should always be adjusted to market rates, as is the case in Holland. The current interest rate in a state seems to serve as a basis for establishing the market price of land. If the current rate is 5% or 1/20th part, the price of land should be the same, i.e. 20 times the amount of interest paid per year on the mortgage of similar land. However, because ownership of land gives a certain status and rights in some states, it will be the case that when interest is 5% or 1/20th part, the price of land is set at 1/24th or 1/25th, 25 times, although the mortgage rate on the same land hardly exceeds the current interest rate. After all, the price of the land, like all other prices, is regulated naturally by the proportion of sellers to buyers, etc. And as there will be many more buyers in London, for example, than in the provinces, and as these buyers who live in the capital will prefer to buy land in their locality rather than in distant provinces, they would rather buy land in their vicinity at 1/30th or 1/35th than distant lands at 1/25th or 1/22nd. There are often other acceptable reasons affecting land prices, unnecessary to mention here, since they do not invalidate our explanations of the nature of interest.